The diner door slammed in her face with a finality that echoed across the dusty street of Copper Springs. "We don't serve your kind here." The owner had snarled, leaving Clara Weston trembling in the merciless Arizona heat of 1885. Alone, penniless, and miles from anywhere, she'd never felt more invisible until a cowboy's shadow fell across her path, and a steady voice asked, "Mighty hot to be standing out here, ma'am." What happened next would change everything. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The summer sun hung over Copper Springs like a furnace door left wide open, baking the Arizona territory until the very air seemed to shimmer and dance above the packed earth streets. It was the kind of heat that made men mean and women weary, the kind that shortened tempers and lengthened shadows. Clara Weston stood in one of those shadows, now pressed against the weathered clapboard wall of Peterson's diner, her stomach hollow with hunger and her eyes burning with something that might have been tears if she'd had any moisture left to spare. She'd been traveling for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of dust and doubt, of cramped stagecoach benches and suspicious stares from fellow passengers who couldn't quite place what made them uncomfortable about the dark-haired woman traveling alone. 3 weeks since she'd buried her father back in St. Bras. Lewison learned that he'd left her something unexpected, a homestead deed to 160 acres of Arizona Territory land he'd claimed years ago, but never told her about land that might be her salvation or her final disappointment. The rejection still rang in her ears sharp as a slap. She'd walked into the diner 15 minutes ago, hat dusty from the road carpet bag heavy on her arm, and asked politely for a meal. Just a simple meal. Anything. She had $3.40 to her name, enough for food and maybe a night's lodging if the prices were fair. The diner had been half empty, just a few ranchers hunched over their plates at the far end, but the owner had looked her up and down with eyes like chips of flint. "We don't serve your kind here," James Peterson had said, his voice carrying across the quiet room with deliberate volume. Clara had stood frozen, confused. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. I can pay." "I don't care if you can pay in gold coins." Peterson had leaned across the counter, his considerable bulk making the wood creak. A woman traveling alone, no husband, no chaperone showing up in a decent town like some kind of... He'd let the sentence hang ugly with implication. "We got standards here. Don't need trouble. Don't need questions. Don't need you." The other diners had looked away, suddenly fascinated by their coffee cups. No one had spoken up. No one had moved. Clara had felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not embarrassment now, but anger, the kind that made her hands shake and her voice go quiet and dangerous. "I'm not trouble," she'd said, each word precise and controlled. "I'm a woman who needs a meal." "Then you can find it somewhere else." Peterson had turned his back to her, dismissing her as thoroughly as if she'd ceased to exist. "Doors behind you." And now here she stood outside in the brutal afternoon heat, feeling the weight of the town's judgment like stones in her pockets. Through the window, she could see Peterson serving one of the ranchers another cup of coffee, laughing at something the incident already forgotten. To him, she was nothing, less than nothing, just another piece of frontier debris to be swept aside. Clara closed her eyes and fought against the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. This was supposed to be a new beginning. After her father's death, after the creditors had taken everything, after the landlord had given her a week to vacate their rooms, this land deed had seemed like providence, a sign, a chance. But now, standing in this hostile town where she couldn't even buy a meal, the reality of her situation crashed over her like a cold wave. She was alone, truly alone. No family, no friends, no allies, just a woman with a piece of paper claiming land she'd never seen in a territory that clearly didn't want her. The street was quiet in the mid-afternoon lull, most folks taking shelter from the heat. A few horses stood tied to hitching posts, their tails swishing at flies. Across the way, a general store advertised flour and feed in faded paint. Further down, she could see the false-fronted buildings that seemed to make up most frontier towns. A saloon, a bank, a land office, all baking in the relentless sun. Clara pushed away from the wall, straightening her spine. She'd spent $3 on the stagecoach fare from Tucson. She had 40 cents left, a carpetbag with 2 changes of clothes and a deed to land that might not even exist. She needed to find the land office, needed to figure out where this homestead was needed to. "Mighty hot to be standing out here, ma'am." The voice came from her left, low and calm, with the kind of steadiness that made her turn before she'd fully processed the words. A man stood a few feet away, one hand resting on the hitching post where a paint horse was tied. He was tall. Most men were compared to Clara's 5'3", with shoulders broad enough to fill out his faded work shirt and a face that sun and weather had carved into something between handsome and hard. His hat shaded eyes that she could nevertheless feel studying her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "I'm fine," Clara said automatically, the lie transparent even to her own ears. The man tilted his head slightly, and she caught a glimpse of those eyes blue, startlingly blue, like the sky just after dawn. His gaze moved past her to the diner window, then back to her face. He didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. "Doesn't look fine from where I'm standing." He pushed away from the hitching post with easy grace. "Looks like maybe Jim Peterson just made a fool of himself again." Clara stiffened. "You saw—" "Didn't have to. Peterson's got exactly 2 moods, ornery and sleeping." The man stepped closer and Clara caught the scent of leather and horse and something else, something clean like sage after rain. "Luke Callahan, ma'am. I ranch about 5 miles north of here." He extended his hand and Clara found herself taking it automatically. His grip was firm but careful, calloused in the way of men who worked with their hands warm despite the heat. "Clara Weston." "Miss Weston." Luke released her hand and considered her for a moment. "I'm guessing you're not from around here." "St. Louis. I arrived on the noon stage." Clara hesitated, then found herself explaining the words coming faster than she intended. "My father passed 6 weeks ago. He left me a land deed, a homestead north of town. I came to claim it, but She trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the diner. Luke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Peterson refused you service." It wasn't a question, but Clara nodded anyway. "Said he doesn't serve my kind. Women traveling alone, apparently." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. For a long moment, Luke said nothing. He turned slightly, looking at the diner with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. Then he looked back at her, and his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but held a certain determination that made Clara's breath catch. "Then let's see about changing that." Before Clara could protest, Luke offered his arm. It was such an old-fashioned gesture, such an unexpected courtesy after the hostilities she'd just endured that Clara found herself staring at him in confusion. "Mr. Callahan, I don't think—" "Luke, and I think you're hungry, Miss Weston. I think you've had a long journey and a rough welcome to our town, and I think Jim Peterson needs to be reminded that common decency isn't optional." His voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Now, if you'll allow me—" Clara looked at his offered arm, then at his face. There was something in his expression, not pity, which she would have rejected, but something else. Respect, maybe. Recognition. As if he saw her not as a problem or a scandal, but simply as a person who deserved better than she'd received. Slowly, Clara placed her hand on his arm. The muscle beneath the worn cotton was solid and steady. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke nodded once, then turned them both toward the diner door. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Luke, he already told me." "He told you wrong." Luke pulled open the door and the cooler air from inside washed over them, along with the smell of coffee and fried meat that made Clara's stomach clench with longing. "After you, Miss Weston." The diner fell silent as they entered. It was like walking into a church or a courtroom, that same heavy watching quiet. Every head turned, every conversation stopped. Clara felt the weight of a dozen stares, felt her courage wavering, but Luke's presence beside her was solid and sure. He guided her to a table near the window, pulled out her chair with the same courtesy he might show a society lady in a San Francisco restaurant, and waited until she sat before taking his own seat across from her. James Peterson stood behind the counter, his face flushing red. "Callahan, I already told this woman—" "You told her wrong." Luke's voice cut across the space, quiet, but carrying an authority that made Peterson's mouth snap shut. "You turned away a paying customer for no good reason. That's not how we do things in Copper Springs, Jim. At least it's not how we're supposed to." "Now you wait just a minute," Peterson sputtered, moving toward their table. "No, you wait." Luke didn't raise his voice, didn't move from his relaxed position in his chair, but something in his tone made Peterson freeze. Miss Weston has traveled 3 weeks to claim her father's homestead. She's tired, she's hungry, and she asked you politely for a meal. You refused her because she's
This
traveling
story
alone,
was
which tells
posted
me
on the
more
channel
about your
west
character
of
than
betrayal.
hers.
Please do not
The silence
repost
in the
it in
diner
any
was
form.
absolute. Clara sat frozen, torn between gratitude and mortification. This wasn't what she'd intended. She'd never wanted to cause a scene, never wanted Peterson. Luke continued, his blue eyes never leaving the diner owner's face. You're going to bring us 2 coffees and whatever's hot. You're going to do it with courtesy. And you're going to remember that the measure of a town isn't how it treats the powerful and connected, it's how it treats strangers who need help. A muscle worked in Peterson's jaw. For a moment, Clara thought he might explode, might order them both out. Around them, the other diners watched with expressions ranging from shocked to thoughtful to carefully neutral. Clara recognized one of the men from the stage, a rancher who'd given her suspicious looks the entire journey from Tucson. Finally, Peterson spoke, his voice tight. I don't need lectures from you, Callahan. Maybe not. Luke shrugged slightly. But Miss Weston needs a meal and you need to decide what kind of man you want to be. That seems pretty simple to me. The standoff stretched for 3 more heartbeats. Then Peterson turned abruptly and stalked back behind his counter, slamming things around with enough force to make dishes rattle. But he was, Clara noticed, pouring coffee. Luke turned his attention to her, and his expression gentled. You all right, Miss Weston? Clara realized her hands were shaking in her lap. She clasped them together, forcing them still. I didn't mean to cause trouble. You didn't cause anything. Peterson did. Luke leaned back slightly as Peterson arrived with 2 cups of coffee, setting them down hard enough to slosh liquid into the saucers. The diner owner stalked away without a word. Luke pushed 1 cup toward Clara. Drink. You look like you need it. The coffee was hot and bitter, and the most welcome thing Clara had tasted in days. She wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her palms, and took a long swallow. Gradually, the conversations around them resumed quieter than before, with occasional glances their direction, but resumed nonetheless. Thank you, Clara said, finally meeting Luke's eyes across the table. I don't know why you did that, but thank you. Did what? Luke's mouth quirked slightly. Helped a neighbor. I'm not your neighbor. I'm a stranger who just caused you trouble with the man who runs the only diner in town. Peterson will get over it, and as for being strangers, Luke shrugged. Everyone's a stranger until they're not. Besides, I meant what I said. The measure of a town is how it treats folks who need help. Clara studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. He was probably in his early 30s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the sun. His hands, wrapped around his own cup, were scarred and work-roughened. There was something solid about him, something dependable that made her think of old trees that had weathered countless storms. You said you ranched north of here, she asked. 5 miles up the canyon road, cattle mostly, some horses. It's not a big operation, but it's mine. Pride flickered briefly in his expression. Built it myself after the war. You fought Union cavalry. Seems like another lifetime now. Luke took a swallow of coffee. What about your father's place? You know where it is? Clara pulled the deed from her carpet bag, unfolding it carefully on the table. Luke leaned forward to study it, his eyes scanning the legal description with practiced ease. Section 36, he murmured. That's about 8 miles north of town, up past my place. His eyes lifted to meet hers. I know that property. Your father was Thomas Weston. Clara's heart jumped. You knew him. Met him once, maybe 6 years ago. He'd filed his claim and was building a cabin, but then he left. Folks said he'd gone back east. Luke's expression turned thoughtful. So he went back to you. He never told me about this place. The old hurt rose in Clara's chest. Never mentioned Arizona, never said he'd claimed land. I found the deed in his papers after he died. He left debts, Mr. Callahan Luke. So many debts. The creditors took everything except this. I thought... She stopped, swallowing hard. You thought it might be a new start, Luke finished quietly. Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Peterson returned with 2 plates of beef stew and cornbread, setting them down with barely controlled resentment. But he didn't say anything, and the food smelled like heaven. Clara's stomach growled audibly. "Eat," Luke said, simply picking up his own spoon. They ate in silence for several minutes. The stew was simple, but good meat and potatoes and carrots in a rich gravy. The cornbread was still warm. Clara ate steadily, feeling strength slowly return to her body. Across from her, Luke ate with the efficient movements of a working man, not bothering with unnecessary conversation while there was food to be consumed. It was only after she'd cleaned her plate and was working on a second cup of coffee that Clara spoke again. "The cabin, is it still standing?" Luke's expression became carefully neutral. "Standing might be a generous word. It's there, but your father never finished it. One-room roof that probably leaks no windows to speak of." He hesitated. "Miss Weston, Clara, I don't want to discourage you, but that land, it's rough country. Rocky soil, limited water. Your father started a well but never finished it. It's not going to be easy." "Nothing about my life has been easy lately," Clara said quietly. "At least this is mine." Something flickered in Luke's eyes, respect perhaps, or recognition of a familiar stubbornness. "Fair enough. You planning to head up there today?" Clara glanced out the window. The sun was already sliding toward the western mountains, though it was still hours from sunset. "I hired a wagon driver to take me when I arrived, but he's refusing to travel after dark. Said the road's too rough. He'll take me tomorrow morning." "Smart man. That road's treacherous if you don't know it, and there's no moon tonight." Luke finished his coffee and set down his cup with a decisive click. "Tell you what, I'll ride up there with you tomorrow. Make sure you find the place, help you get settled." Clara blinked at him, surprised. "Why would you do that?" "Because you're going to be my neighbor," Luke said simply. "And because that country's not forgiving to folks who don't know it. You'll need help, at least at first." He held up a hand before she could protest. "Not charity neighborliness. There's a difference. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing if I'm offering." Luke's mouth curved into a small smile. "Besides, I've got business up that way tomorrow anyway, checking on some cattle in the high pasture. It's not out of my way." Clara studied his face, looking for hidden motives for the catch that surely had to exist. Men didn't help strange women out of pure kindness. There was always an angle, always an expectation. But Luke's expression remained open and honest, his blue eyes steady on hers, without any hint of the calculating look she'd learned to recognize in St. Louis. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you. I'll meet you here tomorrow morning." "Dawn," Luke said. "The earlier we start, the better. It's a rough ride." They finished their coffee and settled the bill, Luke paying for both meals despite Clara's protests. As they stood to leave, Clara noticed the other diners watching them with expressions that ranged from disapproving to curious. Near the back, one older woman gave Clara a small nod, something that might have been approval in her weathered face. Outside, the heat hit them like a physical force after the relative cool of the diner. Luke walked Clara to the small boarding house across the street, where she'd arranged a room for the night. At the steps, he touched the brim of his hat in farewell. "Get some rest, Miss Weston. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Clara," she said impulsively. "If we're going to be neighbors, you should call me Clara." The smile that crossed Luke's face transformed it, softening the hard edges and revealing something warmer underneath. "Clara, then. I'll see you at dawn." She watched him walk back to his paint horse mount with easy grace and ride out of town, heading north. Only when he disappeared around the bend did she allow herself to breathe fully, to process what had just happened. A stranger had defended her, had bought her a meal, had offered to help her reach her father's land, and he'd asked for nothing in return except to be treated like the decent human being he clearly was. Clara climbed the boarding house steps, her carpet bag suddenly feeling lighter than it had all day. Maybe, just maybe, this new life wouldn't be quite as impossible as she'd feared. Inside the small spare room that the boarding house keeper showed her to, Clara stood at the window and looked out over Copper Springs as the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains. The town was small and rough and had rejected her, but somewhere out there 5 miles north was a man who'd shown her more kindness in an hour than she'd received in weeks. And 8 miles north of that was a piece of land that belonged to her. Really, truly belonged to her. Not to creditors or landlords or anyone else, just her. Clara pressed her palm against the warm glass and allowed herself for the first time in months to hope. The sun set over the Arizona Territory in shades
This
of
story
gold
was
and
posted
crimson,
on the channel
painting the
west of
desert in
Betrayal.
colors that seemed
Please
too
do not
vivid to be
repost
real.
it in any form.
As darkness fell and the town began to light its lamps, Clara Weston lay on the narrow boarding house bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about blue eyes and steady hands, and the strange, unexpected grace of a cowboy who'd pulled up a chair beside her when the rest of the world had turned away. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow begins the rest of my life. She had no idea how much that simple act of kindness, a shared meal, a defended dignity, an offered hand would change everything. How it would transform not just her own future, but Luke Callahan's as well. How what began in rejection and hunger would grow into something neither of them had been looking for but both desperately needed. But that was tomorrow's story. Tonight, for the first time since her father's death, Clara Weston slept soundly, dreaming not of debts and loss, but of wide-open spaces and new beginnings, of copper-colored hills and impossibly blue skies, and of a voice saying with quiet conviction, "Then let's see about changing that." Dawn came to Copper Springs the way it always did in the Arizona Territory. Sudden and brilliant, as if someone had struck a match to the eastern horizon. Clara was already dressed and waiting on the boarding house porch when Luke Callahan rode into view leading a sturdy bay mare behind his paint horse. The sky behind him was streaked with pink and gold, and the morning air held a brief coolness that would burn away within the hour. "Thought you might need a horse," Luke called as he approached, swinging down from his saddle with the ease of a man who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. "Unless you planned on walking 8 miles in this heat." Clara descended the steps, eyeing the bay mare with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "I can ride, but it's been a while. My father taught me when I was young before." She trailed off, not wanting to explain how her mother's death had ended those rare moments of closeness with her father. "She's gentle," Luke assured her, bringing the mare forward. "Name's Daisy. She'll take care of you." The horse was indeed placid, standing patiently as Clara approached and stroked her nose. Luke helped Clara mount his hands steady at her waist as he boosted her into the saddle, and Clara tried to ignore the flutter of awareness that touch created. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with simple kindness rather than calculation or contempt. "Your driver's not coming?" Luke asked, mounting his own horse. "I sent word last night that I wouldn't need him." Clara adjusted her skirts as best she could, grateful she'd worn her most practical dress. "Seemed foolish to pay him when you'd offered." Luke nodded and turned his horse north. "We'll take it slow. The road gets rough about 3 miles out." They rode through the quiet streets of Copper Springs as the town began to wake around them. A few early risers watched them pass a shopkeeper sweeping his porch, a woman hanging laundry, children chasing a dog through an alley. Clara felt their stares like pinpricks against her back, could almost hear the gossip that would spread through town before breakfast. The strange woman traveling alone, now riding off into the canyon country with Luke Callahan. The speculation would be vicious. Luke seemed to sense her discomfort. "Don't pay them any mind," he said quietly as they left the last buildings behind. "Small towns always talk. Gives them something to do besides bake in the heat." "Doesn't it bother you being seen with me?" Luke glanced at her, something sharp in his expression. "Why would it bother me?" "Because Clara searched for the right words. "I'm compromised. That's what they'd call it back in St. Louis. A woman alone without proper chaperonage accepting help from a bachelor. It's not done." "This isn't St. Louis." Luke's voice carried an edge now. "And I don't give a damn what busybodies think about me helping a neighbor. If that makes me improper, then I guess I'm improper." Something in Clara's chest loosened at his words, at the casual way he dismissed the social conventions that had bound her entire life. "Thank you," she said softly. They rode in comfortable silence as the landscape opened up around them. The road, really just a rough trail worn by wagon wheels and hoofbeats, wound north through increasingly dramatic terrain. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills studded with mesquite and prickly pear, and in the distance mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks still touched with the coral light of sunrise. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "It grows on you, Chet," Luke agreed. When I first came out here after the war, I thought it was the most godforsaken country I'd ever seen. Too hot, too dry, too empty. But there's something about it, something that gets into your blood. The space, maybe, the sky. Back east, everything feels closed in. Here, he gestured broadly. Here you can breathe. Clara understood exactly what he meant. Despite the heat already building, despite her uncertainty about what lay ahead, she felt something loosening inside her, some tight knot of anxiety that had been wound around her ribs for months. The desert stretched away in all directions, vast and indifferent, and somehow freeing in its indifference. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, wanting to keep him talking, liking the sound of his voice against the morning quiet. Luke's expression softened. "Started it 6 years ago with my mustering out pay and what I'd saved during the war. Bought 50 head of cattle and a broken-down horse, found a good water source in the canyon, and built up from there. It's not much compared to the big operations down in Tucson, but it's mine. Every fence post, every corral board, every head of cattle, I built it with my own hands." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Clara found herself smiling. "No family helping you?" Something flickered across Luke's face, pain quickly masked. "My parents died when I was 17, cholera outbreak in Kansas. I had a brother, but he died at Gettysburg." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "So no family, just me." "I'm sorry," Clara said, and meant it. She knew that particular loneliness, that hollow space where family should be. "What about you?" Luke asked after a moment. "Your mother died when I was 12, pneumonia." The old grief was distant now, worn smooth by time. "After that, it was just my father and me. He worked as a clerk, then a bookkeeper, but he wasn't good with money, or people, or much of anything, really." The bitterness surprised her. "I kept house for him, tried to make ends meet, but there were always debts, always something. When he died, I found out he owed more than 3 years' wages. They took everything, the furniture, my mother's china, even her wedding ring." Luke's hands tightened on his reins. "Bastards." The curse delivered with quiet fury on her behalf made Clara's throat tight. "The deed was the only thing they couldn't touch. It was in my name from before the debts accumulated. My father must have filed it that way years ago." She paused. "I don't know if that was foresight or luck, but it's all I have left of him. This land he claimed and never told me about." They rode on the sun, climbing higher, the heat pressing down. The trail narrowed as they entered a canyon where red rock walls rose on either side, and the sound of their horses' hooves echoed off the stone. Claire's back ached from the unfamiliar position in the saddle, but she refused to complain. Luke had been right. The road was rough, cutting across dry washes and climbing over rocky outcroppings that made Daisy pick her way carefully. "That's my place," Luke said, suddenly pointing to a break in the canyon wall. Clara looked and saw a narrow valley opening to the west, and in its shelter a collection of buildings that spoke of careful planning and hard work. The main house was small but well built, with a covered porch and real glass windows that caught the morning light. Beyond it stood a barn corrals and several smaller outbuildings. Cattle dotted the hillside, grazing on the sparse grass. "You built all that yourself?" Clara asked, awed. "The house and barn, yes. The corrals I added over time." Luke's voice held quiet satisfaction. "There's a spring-fed creek runs through the property. You can't see it from here, but it's what makes ranching possible. Without water, this would just be expensive dust." "It's wonderful," Clara said honestly. The ranch had a settled feeling, a sense of permanence that spoke of roots growing deep. "I'll show you properly sometime," Luke said. "But we should keep moving. Still 3 miles to your father's place." They continued north, climbing higher into the foothills. The landscape grew more rugged, more unforgiving. The trail wound through stands of juniper and pinon pine, crossed stretches of bare rock where the sun hammered down without mercy. Clara's canteen was half empty by the time Luke finally reined in his horse and pointed ahead. "There," he said simply. Clara followed his gaze and felt her heart sink. The cabin sat in a small clearing at the base of a rocky hillside, and cabin was a generous term. It was more of a shack, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a roof of split shingles that was missing pieces in several places. One door hanging crooked on leather hinges and gaps where windows should have been, but weren't. Around it the land stretched away in all directions, rocky and sloped and covered with scrub, that looked like it had never seen a plow. This was her inheritance. This was her fresh start. Clara dismounted slowly, her legs shaky from the ride. Luke swung down beside her, his expression carefully neutral, as he tied both horses
This
to a
story
stunted
was posted
tree.
on the channel west
It's worse
of the
than I
trail.
remembered.
Please do
he
not
admitted
repost
quietly.
it in any form.
Clara walked toward the cabin, her boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. Up close, the place looked even more dilapidated. The door, when she pushed it open, squealed on its hinges and revealed a single room, maybe 12 feet square. Dirt floor. No furniture except a rough shelf attached to one wall. Spiderwebs in the corners. A stone fireplace that at least looked intact, though its chimney was clogged with what appeared to be an old bird's nest. She stood in the doorway and felt the enormity of her situation crash over her like a wave. This was impossible. She couldn't live here. Couldn't make this work. What had she been thinking coming all the way to Arizona on the strength of a deed and a desperate hope? Clara. Luke's voice came from behind her, gentle. It's not as bad as it looks. She laughed, a sharp sound that was dangerously close to a sob. Isn't it? Luke, there's no floor, no windows. The roof has holes in it. She turned to face him. How is this not as bad as it looks? Because it's fixable. Luke stepped past her into the cabin, looking around with a practical eye. The structures sound your father knew what he was doing with the logs. The roof needs patching, but that's easy enough. We can fill the window gaps with oiled paper until you can afford real glass. The floor, he scuffed his boot against the dirt. I can show you how to lay planks. It's work, but it's doable work. I don't have money for lumber, Clara said flatly. I have 40 cents and a few dollars I kept hidden from the creditors. That's it. Luke turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious. Then we use what's here. There's timber in these hills. I've got tools and knowledge. You've got determination and 2 good hands. He paused. Clara, I'm not saying it'll be easy. I'm saying it's possible. Clara wanted to believe him. Desperately wanted to believe him. But the gap between possible and probable seemed vast as the desert sky. Why would you help me? You barely know me. I know enough. Luke moved back to the doorway, standing close enough that she could see the sincerity in his face. I know you traveled 3 weeks to claim this land. I know you stood up to Peterson even after he'd humiliated you. I know you're here looking at this wreck of a place, and you haven't run screaming back to Copper Springs yet. His mouth curved slightly. That tells me you're not someone who gives up easy. Maybe I should give up. The words came out small, defeated. Maybe I should sell the deed to whoever wants this worthless land and use the money to go somewhere. Anywhere but here. You could do that, Luke agreed. Or you could stay. Build something. Make this land into something worth having. He held her gaze. I'm not going to lie to you, it'll be hard. Brutal sometimes. But at the end of it, you'll have something that's yours. Really yours. No one can take it from you. No one can tell you what to do with it. That's worth something, Clara. That's worth a lot. Clara looked back at the cabin, at the land stretching away beyond it. Impossible land. Unforgiving land. But hers. I don't know how, she whispered. Then I'll teach you. Luke's voice was steady as stone. I'll come up here tomorrow with tools and lumber. We'll start with the roof, then the windows, then the floor, one step at a time. I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to. Luke stepped out into the sun, surveying the property with a rancher's eye. But I could use help during roundup next month. If you're willing to work, we'll call it even. Clara followed him outside, her mind racing. It was charity no matter how he dressed it up, but it was also opportunity. A chance. Maybe the only chance she'd get. All right, she said finally. But I want to do this properly. You keep track of your time, your materials. When I can, I'll pay you back. Luke turned to look at her, and something warm flickered in his eyes. Deal. He extended his hand, and Clara shook it, feeling the calluses and strength in his grip. Now, let's see about that. Well, your father started. If we can get water running, half your problems are solved. They spent the next hour exploring the property. Luke showed her where her father had begun digging a well, explaining how to finish it properly. He pointed out the boundary markers, walked her through the acreage, discussed where she might eventually plant crops if she could get water to them. His knowledge seemed bottomless irrigation soil composition. What grew well in this climate, what didn't? Clara listened and tried to remember everything, feeling overwhelmed but also strangely exhilarated. By mid-morning, the heat was oppressive. Luke called a halt and led her to a scraggly cottonwood tree that offered meager shade. They sat with their backs against the trunk, sharing water from Luke's canteen and the hardtack and dried beef he'd brought in his saddlebags. "Thank you," Clara said between bites. "For all of this? For believing it's possible when I can't quite see it yet." Luke studied her for a moment. "You want to know the truth? When I started my place, I didn't think it was possible either. I'd stand in my half-built cabin at night and think I was the biggest fool in the territory, but I kept working. One fence post at a time, one stone laid on another, and eventually," he gestured vaguely back toward his ranch, "eventually it became something real." "How long did it take?" 2 years before I could sleep inside without worrying the roof would collapse. 3 before I turned a profit on the cattle. 5 before I stopped wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Luke's smile was wry. "Building something from nothing, it's slow, but it's also—" He paused, searching for words. "It's yours in a way that nothing else can be. You know every inch of it, every nail and board, because you put them there with your own hands." Clara thought about that as they finished their meal, about ownership that went deeper than a deed, about the kind of knowledge that came from building rather than inheriting. It appealed to something in her, something that had always resented her father's careless stewardship of their lives, his inability to create or maintain anything of value. "Tell me about the war," she said impulsively. "You said you fought." Luke's expression shuddered immediately. "Not much to tell." "You mentioned Gettysburg, that you lost your brother there." For a long moment Luke said nothing. Then slowly he began to speak. "James was 2 years older than me, enlisted right after Fort Sumter. I followed a year later." His voice was distant, remembering. "He died on the second day of the battle in a wheat field outside the town. I found him that evening. He'd been dead for hours." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the flatness in his tone, the careful lack of emotion that suggested wounds too deep to probe. "I'm sorry." War makes us all sorry for something. Luke took a long drink from the canteen. "I stayed in for another year after that, but my heart wasn't in it. When my enlistment was up, I took my pay and came west. Wanted to be as far from that war as I could get. And you found this place." "Found myself, maybe." Luke's eyes focused on her again. "Found a reason to keep going. That's what the land does if you let it. Gives you purpose, direction." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the heat shimmer across the rocky landscape. Clara felt the exhaustion of the past week settling into her bones, the grief, the fear, the desperate uncertainty. But underneath it all was something new, a fragile ember of possibility that Luke's steady confidence was slowly fanning to life. "I should head back," Luke said finally, standing and extending a hand to help Clara up. "I've got cattle to check on. But I meant what I said. I'll be back tomorrow morning with supplies. We'll get you set up properly." They rode back to Luke's ranch in the afternoon heat, and Clara was grateful when he insisted she come inside for water and a brief rest before continuing to town. The interior of his house was simple but comfortable, a main room with a kitchen area and table, a door leading to what she assumed was a bedroom. The walls were chinked tight against the weather. The floors were real pine planks, worn smooth with use, and books lined a shelf near the stone fireplace. "You read," Clara said, surprised. Luke shrugged, pouring her a cup of water from a ceramic pitcher. "Gets lonely out here sometimes. Books help." Clara moved closer to the shelf, reading titles. Poetry Whitman and Dickinson. History. A worn Bible. Agricultural guides. And surprisingly novels Hawthorne and Melville. "Moby Dick, she asked, pulling out the thick volume. "Read it twice." Luke leaned against his table, watching her. "I like stories about obsession, about men chasing impossible things." Clara replaced the book carefully. "Is that what we're doing? Chasing impossible things? Maybe." Luke's eyes held hers. "But sometimes the impossible just means no one else has figured out how yet. Doesn't mean it can't be done." Clara felt something shift between them. Then some unspoken understanding, some recognition of kinship. They were both people who'd lost things, who'd come to this harsh country looking for something they couldn't quite name, both trying to build from nothing because they had nothing left to lose. "I should go," she said softly. "It's a long ride back to town." "Stay here tonight," Luke said suddenly.
This story was posted on
The
the
boarding
channel
house
west
charges
of
too much and you'll
Betrayal.
need to save your
Please
money
do
for
not
supplies.
repost it in any
I've got
form.
a spare room. My brother's room really, though he never saw it. You'll be more comfortable here and we can ride to town together in the morning to get what you need before heading back to your place. Clara knew she should refuse, knew that staying alone with a bachelor in his house would cement every nasty rumor that was probably already circulating through Copper Springs. But she was tired and 40 cents wouldn't stretch far at the boarding house, and Luke's offer came with the same straightforward practicality that seemed to govern all his decisions. "All right," she said. "Thank you." If Luke noticed the weight of that acceptance, the trust it implied, he didn't show it. He simply nodded and showed her to a small bedroom off the main room, sparse but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out toward the mountains. That evening they sat on Luke's porch as the sun set, eating a simple dinner of beans and cornbread that Luke cooked with the efficiency of a man long accustomed to feeding himself. The sky turned the colors of molten copper, and the desert cooled into something almost bearable. In the distance, coyotes began their evening songs. "This is my favorite time," Luke said quietly. "When the day lets go and the night hasn't quite taken hold yet, everything's balanced, peaceful." Clara understood. In this moment, with the food warm in her stomach and the sunset painting the world in impossible colors, and Luke's solid presence beside her, she felt something she hadn't felt in months safe. Not just physically safe, but something deeper, the safety of being seen and accepted without judgment, without expectation. "Luke," she said carefully, "why are you really helping me? And don't say it's just being neighborly." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and honest in the gathering dark. "Because I know what it's like to start over with nothing, to feel like the world's turned its back on you. When I came here 6 years ago, I was half dead inside. The war had taken everything I cared about, and I couldn't see a reason to keep going except that stopping seemed worse." He paused. "A rancher named Bill Garrett took me in, taught me, the country helped me file my claim. Never asked for anything in return except that I pass it on someday. Help someone else the way he helped me." "Where is he now?" "Died 3 years ago. Heart gave out." Luke's voice carried the weight of old grief. "But his kindness didn't die. It's still here in this house, in the knowledge he gave me, in me helping you the way he helped me." He turned to look at her, his face half shadowed in the fading light. "That's why, Clara. Because someone showed me grace when I needed it most. Because we're all just trying to survive out here. And sometimes the only thing that makes survival bearable is knowing someone else cares if we make it or not." Clara felt tears slide down her cheeks, hot and unexpected. She didn't bother wiping them away. "He would be proud of you," she whispered. "This Bill Garrett, he would be proud of the man you became." Luke's throat worked, and for a moment she thought he might cry too. But he just nodded once and turned back to watch the last of the sunset bleed from the sky, leaving them in the gentle darkness that softened all the harsh edges of the desert and made impossible things seem for just a moment beautifully within reach. The days that followed took on a rhythm that surprised Clara with its steadiness. Each morning, Luke arrived at her cabin as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, his wagon loaded with tools and lumber salvaged from his own property or cut fresh from the timber stands in the hills. Each evening, he left as the light began to fail, promising to return the next day. And between those bookends of dawn and dusk, they worked. Clara learned the weight of a hammer, the bite of splinters, the ache of muscles she hadn't known she possessed. Luke taught her to measure twice and cut once, to drive nails straight and true, to read the grain of wood so it wouldn't split under stress. He showed her how to mix mud and straw for chinking, how to weave pine boughs into a temporary roof cover, how to judge the integrity of a structure by the sound it made when you knocked against it. "You're a quick study," he said one afternoon, watching her patch a section of wall with practiced movements that would have been impossible a week earlier. Clara wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of mud across her temple. "I'm motivated. Being able to see the sky through my roof is surprisingly effective encouragement." Luke's laugh was warm and genuine, the sound of it filling the small cabin in a way that made it feel less like a wreck and more like a home in progress. They'd patched the worst of the roof holes, by then replaced the door hinges and fitted oiled paper over the window gaps that cut the wind but still let in light. The cabin was far from finished, but it was becoming livable, barely, but livable nonetheless. On the 8th day they struck water. Clara had been hauling stones for the well wall when Luke's shovel hit something that sounded different, a wet, hollow thunk instead of the dry scrape of packed earth. He'd frozen, then dug faster, and within minutes, water was seeping into the bottom of the hole they'd spent 3 days excavating. "We did it," Clara breathed, staring at the muddy puddle that represented everything survival permanence possibility. Luke had climbed out of the hole, dirt-covered and grinning like a boy. "We did it," he agreed. "Now we just need to shore up the walls, build a proper cover, and you'll have fresh water whenever you need it." Clara had thrown her arms around him without thinking, joy overriding propriety, and for a moment Luke had stood frozen in surprise before his arms came up to return the embrace. They'd stayed like that for 3 heartbeats, maybe 4, both suddenly aware of the warmth of the other's body, the rapid beat of hearts, the way the world seemed to narrow to just this moment, this connection. Clara had pulled back, first flushing. "Sorry, Don't apologize," Luke had said quietly, his blue eyes intense on her face. "Don't ever apologize for being happy." The moment had passed, but something had shifted between them. Something that made the silences more charged, the casual touches more meaningful, the parting each evening more difficult. They didn't speak of it. There was too much work to do, too many practical concerns that demanded attention, but it was there nonetheless, growing like prairie grass after rain, slow and persistent and impossible to ignore. By the end of the 2nd week, the cabin was transformed. The roof was solid. The windows covered, the door hung straight. Luke had helped her build a simple bed frame and table from rough lumber, had shown her how to construct shelves for her few possessions. The fireplace drew properly, now its chimney cleared and the stones remortared where they'd come loose. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. It was shelter. It was hers. "Tomorrow I'll bring up some supplies from town," Luke said one evening as they stood outside watching the sunset paint the rocks crimson. "Flour coffee beans. Enough to get you started. You can pay me back when you're able." "Luke, I can't keep taking from you." "You're not taking. I'm investing." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "In a neighbor who's going to need help getting her first crop in. And someone who might return the favor someday when I need it. That's how it works out here, Clara. We help each other survive." Clara wanted to believe it was that simple, wanted to believe his motives were purely practical, neighborly, exactly what he claimed. But she'd seen the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, had felt her own heart stumble when his hand brushed hers, passing a tool when his voice went soft, saying her name. "I'll pay you back," she said firmly, needing to maintain some boundary, some sense that she wasn't simply accepting charity. "I'll work your roundup like you said, and anything else you need. I'll earn this." "I know you will." Luke's smile was gentle. "You've already proven that 10 times over." He rode out as the stars began to emerge, and Clara stood watching until he disappeared into the gathering dark. Then she went inside her cabin with its solid roof and straight door and water in the well, and allowed herself a moment to simply feel the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. 2 weeks ago, this had seemed impossible. Now she had a home. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Clara was sweeping the dirt floor, planning how she might eventually afford lumber for proper flooring when she heard horses approaching. Her first thought was Luke arriving early, but the sounds were wrong. Too many hooves, voices carrying on the morning air rough and unfamiliar. She stepped outside cautiously and felt her stomach drop. 3 men sat astride their horses in her clearing, and none of them looked friendly. The one in the center was heavy-set and middle-aged, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that assessed her with cold calculation. His companions were younger, harder, the kind of men Clara had learned to avoid in St. Louis's rougher districts. "Can I help you?" Clara asked, keeping her voice steady despite the fear beginning to crawl up her spine. The heavy-set man spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "You, the Weston woman, one who filed claim on this land." "I am. Clara Weston." She straightened her spine, refusing to show weakness. "This is my property. Can I ask your business?" "Name's Harlan Reeves. I run cattle through this territory." He gestured broadly at the surrounding hills. My herd's been using this water source and grazing these slopes for 5 years. Didn't appreciate finding out someone had filed claim. Clara's mind raced. The land was legally homesteaded by my father 6 years ago. I have the deed registered in Tucson. This is federal land, Mr. Reeves.
This story was
Open to
posted on the
homesteading.
channel west of
Federal
Betrayal.
land that I've been
Please do
using.
not repost
Reeves
it
leaned
in any
forward in
form.
his saddle, his bulk making the leather creak. See, out here, we don't care much about what some paper says. We care about who's using the land, who's been here, who has the strength to hold it. The threat was barely veiled, and Clara felt ice slide down her spine. Are you suggesting I don't have the right to my own property? I'm suggesting a lone woman with a half-built shack and no means of defending herself might want to reconsider her position. Reeves's smile was ugly. I'm prepared to make you a fair offer, $500 for the deed. You can take that money and go back wherever you came from, leave the land to folks who know what to do with it. $500 was more money than Clara had seen in her life. It would be enough to start over somewhere civilized, somewhere safe. But it was also insultingly low for 160 acres with water, and the way Reeves was offering made it clear this was less a negotiation than a threat. The land isn't for sale, Clara said, her voice stronger than she felt. Now I'll thank you to leave my property. One of the younger men snickered. Reeves's expression hardened. You might want to think carefully about that answer, Miss Weston. This is rough country. Accidents happen, cabins catch fire, lone women. He let the sentence hang pregnant with menace. It'd be a shame if something unfortunate happened because you were too stubborn to accept a generous offer. Clara's fear transformed into anger, white-hot and clarifying. Is that a threat, Mr. Reeves? It's a warning. Take it however you like. Reeves gathered his reins. You've got 3 days to reconsider. After that, well, like I said, accidents happen. They rode out, leaving Clara standing alone in the clearing with her heart hammering and her hands trembling with suppressed fury. She waited until they were out of sight before her knees buckled and she sat down hard on her doorstep, trying to process what had just happened. She needed help, needed advice, needed someone who understood this territory and its unwritten rules. She needed Luke. The ride to his ranch took an hour, pushing Daisy faster than was probably wise on the rough trail. Clara found Luke in his corral, working with a young horse, his shirt damp with sweat, despite the morning cool. He looked up at the sound of her approach, and his expression shifted immediately from concentration to concern. Clara, what's wrong? She dismounted quickly, the words tumbling out. There were men at my cabin, 3 of them. The leader said his name was Harlan Reeves. Reeves. Luke's face went hard as stone. What did he want? My land. He offered $500 for the deed, said he'd been using the property for grazing and water, that I should leave before something unfortunate happened. Clara's voice shook slightly. Luke, he threatened me, not directly, but the meaning was clear. Luke was already moving, tying off the young horse and striding toward his house. How long ago? Maybe an hour. I came straight here. Good. Luke emerged from his house with a rifle, checking its load with practiced efficiency. You're staying here today. I'm going to ride into town, talk to the sheriff. The sheriff? Clara felt a flicker of hope. You think he'll help? Luke's expression was grim. Depends on whether Reeves has gotten to him first. But it's worth trying. In the meantime, you're not going back to that cabin alone, not until this is settled. I can't just abandon my property. That's probably what Reeves wants to scare me off so he can claim I've deserted it. You're not abandoning anything. You're being smart. Luke moved to her, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders gently. Clara Harlan Reeves is dangerous. He came here 15 years ago and carved out a cattle empire through intimidation and violence. He doesn't respect federal law or property rights. He respects force, and right now, you don't have any. So what do I do? Just give up. Let him win. No, you let me help you. Luke's eyes searched hers. Stay here while I go to town. If the sheriff won't intervene, we'll figure out another solution. But you're not facing Reeves alone. I won't let that happen. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest at his fierce protectiveness. Why does he even want my land? He said he has an empire. What's 160 acres to him? It's not about the land itself. It's about control. Luke released her shoulders reluctantly. Reeves has spent years driving out homesteaders, buying up deeds from people he's terrorized. He wants to own this entire stretch of territory control, all the water, and grazing rights. Your father's claim is right in the middle of what Reeves considers his domain. He probably thought the land would revert to public domain after your father left, but then you showed up with a valid deed and ruined his plans. So he'll try to drive me out like he did the others. He'll try. Luke's voice carried absolute conviction. But he won't succeed. Not while I'm here. The ride into Copper Springs took 2 hours, and Clara spent them in Luke's house trying not to imagine all the ways Reeves might make good on his threats. She cleaned to keep busy, swept floors that didn't need sweeping, organized shelves that were already organized. When that failed to calm her racing thoughts, she finally settled into Luke's chair and picked up the volume of Whitman from his shelf, trying to lose herself in poetry about grass and democracy and the beauty of the common man. She was still reading when Luke returned in the late afternoon, his face dark with anger. "The sheriff won't help," he said without preamble, tossing his hat onto the table with more force than necessary. "Says it's a civil matter that Reeves made you a legitimate offer and you're free to accept or decline it. Claims he can't intervene in property disputes unless there's actual violence. Even though Reeves threatened me. Your word against his." Luke paced the room like a caged animal. "The sheriff's been in Reeves's pocket for years. Everyone knows it, but no one can prove it. Reeves contributes generously to his re-election campaigns, makes sure his deputies get bonuses at Christmas. They're not going to cross him for a newcomer with no influence." Clara closed the book carefully, trying to think. "So the law won't help. What are my options?" Luke stopped pacing and looked at her. "You could sell, take the money and leave." "No." "Clara." "No." She stood facing him squarely. "I'm not running. Not again. I ran from St. Louis with nothing but a deed and desperation. I'm not giving up the only thing I have left because some bully with more money than morals thinks he can intimidate me." Something fierce and approving flashed in Luke's eyes. "Then we fight." "How you said yourself he's dangerous. I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." Luke moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "Here's what we do. First, you don't stay at your cabin alone anymore. You bunk here until this is resolved. Second, I put word out to the other ranchers. Not everyone likes Reeves. He's made enemies. Some might be willing to stand with us if it comes to that. Third, we make sure you're never alone on your property. I'll ride up with you when you need to work there, and we'll make it clear to anyone watching that you're not defenseless. That could take weeks, months. I can't impose on you like that." "It's not imposition if I'm volunteering." Luke's voice softened. "Clara, I'm not letting Reeves run you off. Not when you've worked this hard, come this far, and not when—" He stopped, something complicated crossing his face. "Not when what?" Clara asked quietly. Luke was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Clara heard all the things neither of them had been willing to say. The growing attachment, the deepening connection, the way they'd begun to orient their days around each other's presence. "Not when I've gotten used to having you around," Luke finally said, his voice rough with honesty. "Not when I wake up looking forward to riding up to your cabin and spending the day working beside you. Not when I've started thinking about you as more than just a neighbor who needs help." Clara's breath caught. "Luke, I know it's not the time for this." He stepped back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I know you've got more important things to worry about than whatever this is between us. But I needed you to know. Needed you to understand that I'm not helping you out of charity or obligation. I'm helping you because I care what happens to you. Because somewhere between that first day in the diner and now you became important to me." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and brave. Clara felt her heart racing, felt the pull toward him like gravity, like something inevitable and right. But he was correct, this wasn't the time. Not with Reeves's threat hanging over them, not with her future so uncertain. "I care about you too," she said softly, giving him that much truth. "More than I probably should, more than is wise." "Nothing about this situation is wise," Luke said with a slight smile. "We're two stubborn people trying to make a life in country that doesn't want us fighting a man with 10 times our resources. Wisdom would suggest we both cut our losses and run." "Good thing we're not particularly wise, then." Luke's laugh was short but genuine. "Good thing." They stood looking at each other for another moment, and Clara felt the weight of possibility pressing against the immediate danger of their situation. Whatever was growing between them would have to wait. Survival came first, but knowing it was there, knowing Luke felt the same pull she did that gave her strength she hadn't known she possessed. "So I stay here," she said, turning the conversation back
This
to practical
story was
matters.
posted on the
We
channel
work my
west
place
of
together.
Betrayal.
We wait to see
Please
what
do not
Reeves does
repost
next.
it in any form.
And we prepare, Luke added. "I'll teach you to shoot. A rifle at least and a pistol if you're willing. Out here knowing how to defend yourself isn't optional." Clara thought of the rifle her father had owned sold years ago to pay rent. She'd shot it once at his insistence and hated the noise and recoil, but that was before she'd had something worth defending. "Teach me," she said. They spent the remaining daylight hours in shooting practice. Luke set up targets behind his barn, old bottles and tins arranged on fence posts, and showed Clara how to hold the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. The first shot nearly knocked her backward with its recoil, and the noise made her ears ring. But Luke was patient, adjusting her stance, teaching her to anticipate the kick, showing her how to breathe and aim and fire in one smooth motion. By the time the light began to fail, Clara could hit 3 out of 5 targets at 20 yards. It wasn't expert marksmanship, but it was better than nothing. It was the difference between helpless and dangerous, and that mattered. "You'll improve with practice," Luke said as they walked back to the house, his rifle comfortable against his shoulder. "But you've got good instincts. You don't flinch, and you keep your eyes open. That's half the battle. The other half being actually hitting what I'm aiming at. That comes with time." Luke held the door for her. "I'll cook tonight. You must be exhausted." Clara was exhausted, but it was the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for hours. She sat at Luke's table and watched him move around his kitchen with easy competence, frying salt pork and heating beans, making coffee strong enough to strip paint. The domestic simplicity of it soothed something raw in her, this moment of normalcy carved out of a day that had started with threats and fear. "Tell me about Bill Garrett," she said as Luke set plates on the table. "The man who helped you when you first came here." Luke settled into his chair, considering the question. "He was probably 60 when I met him, though the frontier ages people, so it's hard to say for sure. Been ranching in Arizona territory since before the Mexican War. He found me about a week after I arrived, half-starved and completely lost, trying to figure out how to file a homestead claim." A smile touched Luke's mouth at the memory. He took one look at me and said, "Son, you planning to die out here or learn how to live?" I said I hadn't decided yet. He said, "Well, while you're deciding, you might as well come eat." And he taught you everything. Everything that matters. How to read the land, find water, judge cattle. Which plants are poison, which snakes to avoid, how to predict weather by watching the sky. Luke paused, his expression distant. But more than that, he taught me that the frontier doesn't have to make you hard. That you can survive out here and still maintain your humanity, still help people, still believe in something beyond just yourself. Clara reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. You honor his memory. Every time you help someone, every act of kindness, you keep him alive. Luke turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. They sat like that while their food cooled, connected by touch and understanding, two people who'd found each other in unlikely circumstances and were trying to build something worth keeping. The moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Luke was on his feet, instantly releasing Clara's hand and reaching for his rifle. "Stay inside," he ordered, moving to the door. But Clara followed him to the porch, her heart hammering. In the gathering dusk, a rider was approaching at a gallop, and as he drew closer, Clara recognized him as one of Luke's neighbors, a grizzled rancher named Tom Hensley, who owned land to the east. "Callahan," Hensley called, reining his horse hard. "There's fire up at the Weston place, big one. Started maybe 20 minutes ago." Clara felt the world tilt. No, that's not possible. But even as she spoke, she could see it. To the north, against the darkening sky, an orange glow painted the horizon. Smoke rose in a dark column visible even from this distance. Her cabin. Her home. Everything she'd built over the past 2 weeks was burning. Luke was already moving, saddling his horse with swift efficiency. "Clara, stay here." "Like hell I will." Claire was running for Daisy, her exhaustion forgotten in a surge of desperate energy. "That's my property! I'm coming!" Luke looked like he wanted to argue, but there was no time. Within minutes, they were mounted and riding hard toward the North Hensley accompanying them. Other riders appeared from neighboring ranches as word spread drawn by the fire glow and the unwritten code that you always helped fight fire, regardless of whose property was burning. The ride that usually took an hour, they covered in half that time, pushing their horses recklessly over the rough trail. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the smell of smoke grew stronger, acrid, and choking, and then they crested the final rise and Clara saw it. Her cabin was an inferno. Flames engulfed the walls, reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. The roof, so carefully patched, was collapsing inward in showers of sparks. The heat was tremendous, even from 100 yards away, driving them back, making the horses shy and buck. "The well!" Luke shouted over the roar of flames. "Form a bucket line from the well. We need to wet down the surrounding brush before this spreads." The next hours were a blur of heat and smoke and desperate labor. Clara worked alongside the men hauling water from her well, at least that had survived passing buckets hand to hand, dousing the dry grass and scrub around the burning cabin. They couldn't save the structure itself. That was lost. But they could prevent the fire from spreading to the surrounding forest, from consuming the entire hillside in an inferno that would threaten every ranch in the valley. Clara's hands blistered. Her lungs burned from smoke inhalation. Her clothes were soaked with water and sweat and ash. But she kept working, driven by fury more than hope. This was arson. She knew it with absolute certainty. Reeves had done this, or someone acting on his orders. This was his answer to her refusal to sell. By the time they finally got the blaze under control, the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. The cabin was gone. Nothing remained but smoldering logs and the stone fireplace standing like a gravestone among the ruins. Everything else, her bed, her table, the few possessions she'd managed to accumulate, was ash. Clara stood staring at the destruction, too numb for tears. She'd had a home for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of security, of possibility of building something that was hers. And now it was gone, reduced to smoke and cinders by a man who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to remove. Luke appeared at her shoulder, his face blackened with soot. "Clara, he did this." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Reeves, this is what he meant by accidents." "Probably." Luke's jaw was tight with suppressed rage. "But we can't prove it. He'll have an alibi, witnesses placing him somewhere else. That's how men like him operate." The other ranchers were gathering their horses, preparing to head home after the long night's work. Tom Hensley approached, his face grim. "Miss Weston, I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened." "No, it shouldn't have." Clara met his eyes directly. "But it did. And I need to know, are you all going to let Reeves keep doing this? Keep burning out homesteaders, intimidating anyone who stands up to him?" Hensley shifted uncomfortably. Several other ranchers looked away. "Miss Weston, Reeves is powerful. He's got money-influenced men willing to do his dirty work. Standing against him is a good way to end up like—" He gestured at the smoking ruins. "Like this," Clara finished. "I understand. You're all too afraid to help." "It's not fear," another rancher spoke up defensively. "It's survival. We've got family's property to protect. We can't afford to make an enemy of Harlan Reeves." "Then you've already lost," Clara said quietly. "You've let him win. Let him turn this territory into his personal kingdom while you all bow and scrape and hope he doesn't notice you." The words hung heavy in the smoke-tainted air. Some of the ranchers looked ashamed. Others looked angry. But none of them contradicted her. They dispersed slowly, riding back to their own properties, leaving Clara and Luke alone with the ruins. The sun was fully up now, revealing the full extent of the destruction in merciless detail. Even the oiled paper windows had burned along with every bit of progress they'd made. "I'll rebuild," Clara said into the silence. "I'll rebuild, and I'll stay, and I'll make Reeves regret ever threatening me." Luke turned to look at her, something like awe in his expression. "You're serious?" "Completely." Claire's hands clenched into fists. "He thinks fire will drive me away." "He's wrong. I'll rebuild bigger, better. I'll file a complaint with the territorial governor, write to the federal land office, make enough noise that Reeves can't simply burn me out and pretend it never happened. That could take months, years even. I don't care. Clara met his eyes, letting him see the steel that had been forged in the past weeks of hardship. This is my land, Luke. Mine. And I'm not giving it up. Not to Reeves, not to anyone. Luke studied her for a long moment, then smiled a real smile, fierce and proud. Then
This
we
story
rebuild.
was posted
And this
on the
time
channel
we build it
west
strong
of
enough
Betrayal.
that even Reeves'
Please do
fire
not
can't touch
repost
it.
it in
They
any
rode
form.
back to Luke's ranch in silence, both too exhausted for words. Clara's eyes burned from smoke and lack of sleep. Her hands throbbed where blisters had formed and burst, and every muscle in her body ached from the night's desperate labor. But beneath the physical exhaustion ran a current of fury so pure and cold it kept her upright in the saddle. Luke helped her dismount when they reached his house, his hand steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle. "You need to rest," he said quietly. "I need to ride into town. File a formal complaint. Get this on record." "Clara, you can barely stand." "I don't care." She pulled away from him, swaying slightly. "Every hour I wait gives Reeves more time to cover his tracks to construct his alibi. I need to act now." Luke studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Give me an hour. Let me clean up, change horses. Then we'll ride in together." "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." His voice carried an edge of steel. "You think I'm letting you face this alone after everything?" He stepped closer, and Clara could see the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Reeves burned down your home, Clara. He could have killed you if you'd been there. This isn't just your fight anymore." Something in Clara's chest loosened at his words. She wasn't alone. Despite everything, despite the fear and the odds stacked against them, she had Luke standing beside her. That mattered more than she could express. "1 hour," she agreed softly. "Then we go." Luke made her wash and eat while he tended the horses and changed into clean clothes. Clara scrubbed the soot from her face and hands, wincing as soap found every raw blister, then forced down the bread and cheese Luke set before her. Her stomach rebelled at first, still churning with adrenaline and rage, but she made herself eat. She'd need her strength for what was coming. True to his word, Luke was ready within the hour. They rode into Copper Springs as the sun climbed toward noon, the town busy with Saturday commerce. People stopped to stare as they passed, taking in their soot-stained clothes and grim expressions. Word of the fire had clearly spread. The sheriff's office was a small adobe building near the center of town. Inside, Sheriff Tom Bradley sat behind a scarred desk, working through a stack of papers with the concentration of a man trying to look busy. He looked up as they entered, and Clara saw resignation flicker across his face. "Miss Weston, Callahan." Bradley set down his pen. "Heard about the fire. Terrible business." "Terrible business." Clara's voice was sharp. "Sheriff, my home was burned to the ground. This was arson, and I'm here to file a formal complaint against Harlan Reeves." Bradley's expression became carefully neutral. "Now, Miss Weston, you can't just go accusing people without evidence. Do you have any proof Reeves was involved?" "He threatened me 3 days ago. Told me accidents happen to stubborn women who don't know when to leave." Clara leaned forward, palms flat on the sheriff's desk. "Now my cabin's burned down. That's not coincidence, Sheriff. That's a man making good on his threats." "Threats are one thing. Proof is another." Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "I'd need witnesses, physical evidence, something concrete. What you're describing is conjecture." "What about the timing?" Luke interjected. "Clara refuses Reeves's offer, and 3 days later, her property burns. You don't find that suspicious?" "I find it unfortunate." Bradley's tone suggested the conversation was over. "But Harlan Reeves was in town last night, playing cards at the saloon from sundown until well past midnight. I know because I was there. Saw him myself. So unless he can be in 2 places at once, he didn't set that fire." Clara felt rage bubbling up her throat. "Then he paid someone to do it. One of his men." "Again, without proof, that's just speculation." Bradley stood, signaling the end of the interview. "I'm sorry about your home, Miss Weston, truly, but I can't arrest a man based on timing and suspicion. If you find actual evidence, bring it to me. Until then, my hands are tied." "Your hands are tied by Reeves's money," Clara said flatly. "Everyone knows he owns you, Sheriff. The question is whether you can look yourself in the mirror knowing you're protecting a man who burns women out of their homes. Bradley's face flushed red. That's enough. I've been patient with you, Miss Weston, but you're treading on dangerous ground. Making accusations against prominent citizens without evidence is slander. You do well to remember that. Luke's hand came to rest on Clara's shoulder, firm and warning. Come on, we're done here. They left the sheriff's office with nothing accomplished except confirming what they'd already known: the law wouldn't help them. Reeves had bought himself immunity, and no amount of righteous anger would change that. What now? Clara asked, as they stood in the street, the midday sun beating down mercilessly. Now we make noise. Luke's jaw was set. If the law won't listen, we make sure everyone else does. The newspaper, the land office, anyone who'll pay attention. We make this public enough that Reeves can't simply bury it. They spent the next hour doing exactly that. The Copper Springs Gazette occupied a narrow building at the end of Main Street, and its editor, a sharp-eyed man named Henry Walsh, listened to Clara's story with growing interest. This is the third homesteader burned out in as many years, Walsh said, making notes. All of them on land Reeves wanted, but no one's been willing to go on record before. I'm willing, Clara said firmly. Print my name, print everything. I want people to know what Harlan Reeves does to anyone who stands in his way. Walsh looked at her seriously. Miss Weston, you understand this will make you even more of a target. Once this is in print, Reeves will know you're not backing down. He'll escalate. Let him escalate, Clara's voice was hard. I'm done being intimidated. The article ran in the next edition front page. Clara's accusations in stark black and white for the entire territory to read. The response was immediate and divided. Some people, mostly newcomers and homesteaders who'd suffered under Reeves's intimidation, expressed support. Others, the established ranchers and businessmen whose prosperity depended on staying in Reeves's good graces, condemned Clara as a troublemaker spreading vicious lies. The divide was most apparent in town. When Clara accompanied Luke to the general store for supplies, the owner's wife served them with tight-lipped disapproval. At the hardware store, the clerk openly sneered. But the seamstress who'd been setting up shop in town gave Clara a quiet nod of approval, and the new school teacher stopped her on the street to say she admired her courage. You're making enemies, Luke observed as they loaded their wagon. I already had enemies. Clara secured a rope over the lumber they'd purchased. At least now I know who they are. They were loading the last of the supplies when a woman's voice called out, Miss Weston, might I have a word? Clara turned to find a handsome woman in her 40s approaching, dressed in practical riding clothes with an air of quiet authority about her. Something in her weathered face suggested years spent under the western sun. Martha Duval, the woman introduced herself, extending her hand. I ranch about 10 miles south of town. Read your article in the Gazette. Clara shook her hand wary. And I wanted you to know not everyone thinks you're a liar or a troublemaker. Martha's voice was firm. My husband and I filed a homestead claim 8 years ago. Reeves tried to run us off too. Burned our barn, poisoned our well, had his men harass us every chance they got. How did you survive it? Clara asked. Stubbornness. And we had enough manpower to defend ourselves. Martha glanced at Luke, then back to Clara. We also made it clear we'd shoot anyone who threatened us on our property. Reeves respects force. It's the only thing he respects. Clara felt something shift in her understanding. You're saying I need to be willing to kill for my land. I'm saying you need to be willing to defend it. Whether that means killing, Martha shrugged, that's between you and your conscience, but Reeves needs to know you're not just talk, that there will be consequences if he comes after you again. Luke had been listening quietly. Now he spoke up. Martha, you offering something specific here? Martha smiled slightly. I'm offering friendship and information. Reeves's men like to drink at the saloon in Clarkdale, about 15 miles north. They get loose-tongued when they're drunk. Might be worth someone paying attention to what they say. It was the first real lead they'd gotten, and Clara seized it. Thank you, truly. Don't thank me yet. This fight's just beginning. Martha tipped her hat. But when you're ready to rebuild, send word. My husband and I will come help, and we'll bring rifles. She rode off, leaving Clara and Luke looking at each other with renewed determination. They had an ally. One ally against Reeves's empire wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The ride back to Luke's ranch was thoughtful. Clara turned Martha's words over in her mind, considering what it meant to truly defend her property. Could she shoot someone, kill someone if it came to that? A month ago, she would have said no without hesitation. But that was before she'd stared at the ruins of her home, before she'd felt the violation of having everything she'd built destroyed by someone who saw her as disposable. You're thinking about what
This
Martha
story
said,
was posted on the
Luke
channel
observed.
West of Betrayal.
I am.
Please do not
Clara
repost
kept
it
her eyes
in
on
any
the road
form.
ahead. I keep wondering if I have it in me. To use violence. To potentially kill someone defending my land. Luke was quiet for a moment. I killed men during the war. Not many, but enough. It changes you. Even when it's necessary, even when it's them or you, it leaves a mark. Do you regret it? I regret that it was necessary, that the world is ugly enough to require it. Luke's voice was heavy with old sorrow. But no, I don't regret defending myself or my brothers in arms. Sometimes violence is the only language evil men understand. Clara absorbed this. If Reeves comes for me again, if his men show up on my property, I need to know I can pull the trigger, that I won't freeze. Then we practice more, Luke said simply, every day if necessary, until it becomes instinct instead of choice. They spent the following weeks in a strange rhythm of preparation and rebuilding. Each morning, Luke drilled Clara in marksmanship until her hands were steady and her aim true. She learned to load and fire, not just the rifle, but also the revolver Luke loaned her, learned to shoot from different positions, learned to judge distance and adjust for wind. The targets became more complex, moving bottles swinging from strings tins at varying distances, quick draws against Luke's count. You're getting good, Luke said one afternoon after Clara hit 5 consecutive targets without missing. Better than good. I'm getting dangerous, Clara corrected. There's a difference. In the afternoons, they worked on her property. But this time they built differently. Instead of wood that could burn, Luke showed her how to work with adobe mud and straw baked into bricks that would stand up to fire. It was slower work, more labor-intensive, but the walls they built were thick and solid and fireproof. Other hands joined the effort. Martha Duval came as promised, bringing her husband Thomas and their 2 grown sons. They worked for 3 days straight, helping lay the foundation and begin the walls. A few other ranchers' ones who'd been quietly suffering under Reeves's dominance sent supplies or stopped by to offer a day's labor. It wasn't many, but each one represented someone choosing courage over comfort. You're building more than a house, Martha observed one evening as they surveyed the progress. You're building resistance, showing people it's possible to stand up to Reeves. I'm just trying to have a home, Clara said. It's the same thing. Martha's smile was knowing. Reeves has spent years making people believe he's unstoppable. Every day you stay here, every brick you lay, you prove him wrong. The new cabin took shape slowly through the summer heat. Adobe walls rising thick and strong. A tin roof that wouldn't burn. Real windows with shutters that could be barred from inside. It was smaller than Clara had originally planned, but defensible. Luke insisted on that, on narrow window slits that could be used to fire from on a heavy door, with proper locks on a root cellar that could serve as a refuge if things went truly bad. You're building a fort, Clara said one day, watching him reinforce the door frame. I'm building something that'll keep you alive. Luke's voice was grim. Reeves hasn't struck again yet, but he will. Men like him don't give up just because someone embarrasses them in the newspaper. Clara knew he was right. The waiting was its own form of torture, every sound making her jump, every rider approaching, setting her heart racing, but she refused to let fear paralyze her. She worked. She practiced. She built. And slowly the cabin became real again. Through it all,
This
what grew
story was
between her and
posted
Luke
on the
became
channel West
increasingly
of
impossible
Betrayal.
to ignore.
Please do not
They'd fall into
repost
bed
it in any
exhausted
form.
each night. Luke in his room, Clara in the spare, but Clara found herself lying awake, acutely aware of his presence just beyond the wall, aware of how his hands felt steadying her during target practice, how his voice softened when he said her name, how his eyes followed her with an intensity that made her breath catch. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching another spectacular sunset, Clara finally voiced what they'd both been dancing around. Luke, what are we doing? He didn't pretend to misunderstand. Building your cabin, fighting Reeves, surviving. That's not what I mean. Luke turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. I know what you mean. The silence stretched between them, charged with everything unspoken. Finally, Luke spoke. I care about you, Clara, more than I've cared about anyone since before the war. But you're in danger. You're fighting for your land, your future. This isn't the time for... He gestured helplessly between them. For what? For us to acknowledge what's happening between us. Clara felt frustration rise. Luke, I nearly died in that fire. Life is too short and too uncertain to pretend we don't feel what we feel. And what do we feel? Luke's voice was rough, almost challenging. Clara met his eyes directly. I feel like I found something I didn't know I was looking for. Like you're the first person who's ever seen me, really seen me, and decided I was worth fighting for. Like this thing between us is as real and solid as the adobe walls we're building. Luke's hands clenched on his knees. Clara, tell me you don't feel the same. Tell me I'm imagining this connection and I'll stop. I'll focus on my land and my cabin and pretend there's nothing more between us than neighborly assistance. I can't tell you that. Luke's voice was barely above a whisper. Because it would be a lie. The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Clara felt her heart racing, felt the pull toward him like gravity. Then what are we waiting for? She asked softly. Luke stood abruptly, pacing to the porch railing. I'm waiting for you to be safe, for this threat to pass. I'm waiting because I won't be the man who takes advantage of a woman in a vulnerable position, who uses your need for protection as leverage for... He stopped, his jaw working. For what? For affection. For connection. Clara stood and moved to him. Luke, you're not taking advantage. I'm choosing this. Choosing you. You don't know what you're choosing. Luke turned to face her and Clara could see the war in his expression. I'm rough, Clara, hardened by war and frontier living. I don't know pretty words or proper courtship. I live in a small ranch house miles from town and spend my days covered in dirt and cow shit. That's not the life you deserve. It's exactly the life I want. Clara stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. I don't need pretty words or proper courtship. I need honesty, loyalty. Someone who sees me as a partner, not property. Someone who... She paused, gathering courage. Someone who looks at me the way you do. Like I'm strong enough to face anything. Luke's control finally broke. He pulled her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of weeks of restraint, and Clara went willingly, wrapping her arms around his neck. For a moment they just held each other, breathing in sync, hearts racing together. Then Luke's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. You are strong enough to face anything, he whispered. You're the strongest person I've ever met. Clara rose on her toes and kissed him. The kiss was everything she'd been imagining and nothing she'd expected. Soft at first, almost tentative, then deepening into something fierce and claiming. Luke's arms tightened around her, pulling her closer, and Clara lost herself in the taste of him, the feel of his hands in her hair, the way he kissed her like she was precious and powerful all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. This changes things, he said quietly. Good. Clara smiled against his mouth. Things needed changing. They stayed like that as the stars emerged overhead, holding each other in the darkness, no longer fighting what had been building between them since that first day in the diner. And for the first time in weeks, Clara felt something beyond fear and fury. She felt hope, not just for her land or her future, but for something deeper, for the possibility of building a life with someone who saw her worth, who chose to stand beside her when the world said she should stand alone. The next morning brought harsh reality crashing back. Clara was helping Luke feed his horses when they heard a rider approaching fast. It was Tom Hensley, the neighbor who'd brought news of the fire, and his face was grim. Callahan, Miss Weston. He reined up hard. You need to see this, both of you. They followed him north at a gallop, dread building in Clara's stomach. When they reached her property, she understood why Hensley had come. The new cabin, still unfinished but so close to completion, was intact. But the well had been poisoned. Dead animals floated in the water, their bodies already bloating in the heat. And scrawled across the adobe walls in crude paint were the words, Last warning. Clara dismounted slowly, staring at the destruction. Reeves hadn't used fire this time. He'd found another way to hurt her, to make life on this land impossible. Without water, she couldn't survive here. Couldn't keep livestock, couldn't irrigate crops.
This
couldn't
story
even
was
drink.
posted on the channel west
Sorry,
of Betrayal.
Tinsley said quietly.
Please do not
My boys
repost
found
it in
it
any
this morning.
form.
Thought you should know right away. Luke was already moving toward the well, his face dark with rage. He stared down into the fouled water, then looked at Clara. We'll dig another well, further from the cabin. This one's ruined, but we can start fresh. That'll take weeks. Clara's voice was flat. Maybe months to hit water again. Then we take weeks. Luke moved to her side, his presence solid. We haul water from my place until the new well's ready. We don't give up. Clara looked at the ugly words painted on her walls, at the dead animals in her well, at the deliberate cruelty of it all. Reeves had been watching them, waiting for them to invest more time, more effort, more hope. And then he'd struck again, not with fire this time, but with something just as devastating. He's not going to stop, she said quietly. He'll keep finding new ways to hurt me until I give up or die trying. Probably. Luke's honesty was brutal but necessary. So the question is, do you let him win, or do you fight back? Clara thought about Martha's words, about the need to show Reeves there would be consequences, about the difference between being a victim and being dangerous. I fight back, she said, her voice hardening to steel, but not by just surviving his attacks. I need to make him pay for what he's done. Luke studied her face. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time we found out what his men say when they're drunk in that saloon. Clara turned to face him fully. I'm thinking we gather evidence that can't be ignored even by a sheriff in Reeves's pocket. And I'm thinking Reeves needs to understand that threatening me comes with a cost. Something fierce and approving flashed in Luke's eyes. That's dangerous thinking. Good. Clara's smile was sharp as broken glass. Dangerous is exactly what I need to be. They spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess, hauling the dead animals from the well, scrubbing the paint from the walls. The well itself was beyond saving the water thoroughly contaminated. But as Luke had said, they could dig another, could haul water in the meantime, could keep building despite Reeves's best efforts to drive her away. That night back at Luke's ranch, they made plans. Luke would ride to Clarkdale, spend time in the saloon where Reeves's men drank, listen to their boasting. Would continue working on the cabin with Martha's help, would make a show of being undeterred by the poisoned well, and they'd wait for Reeves to make his next move because he would make one. Men like him always did. Be careful, Clara said as Luke prepared to ride out the next morning. These men are dangerous. So am I when I need to be. Luke pulled her close, kissing her with a thoroughness that left her breathless. Stay with Martha while I'm gone. Don't go to your property alone. I won't. Clara held him tighter. Come back safe. Always. Luke mounted his horse but paused before riding off. Clara, what we started last night, that's real for me. Whatever happens with Reeves, whatever comes next, I need you to know that. It's real for me too, Clara said softly. More real than anything I've felt in my life. Luke nodded once, his expression fierce with emotion, then wheeled his horse and rode north toward Clarkdale. Clara watched until he disappeared, then turned back to face another day of building and waiting and preparing for whatever Reeves would throw at them next. The war wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. But Clara was no longer the frightened woman who'd been turned away from a diner in the heat. She'd been tested by fire and threat and loss, and she'd emerged harder, sharper, dangerous.
This story was posted on the channel west of Betrayal.
Forged her into something
Please
that
do
could
not
fight
repost
back.
it in any
And fight
form.
back she would. Luke was gone for 3 days, and they were the longest 3 days of Clara's life. She stayed with Martha and Thomas Duvall, as promised, helping with their ranch work while trying not to imagine all the ways Luke's mission could go wrong. Every evening, she climbed to the highest point on the Duvall property and stared north toward Clarkdale, watching for a rider that didn't come. He'll be fine, Martha said on the second night, finding Clara at her vigil. Luke Callahan's not a man who takes foolish risks. He's taking this risk for me, Clara replied, her voice tight with worry. If something happens to him because I wanted evidence against Reeves, then it would still be his choice. Martha settled beside her on the rocky outcrop. You didn't force him, Clara. He's fighting for you because he wants to, because he cares about you. Clara turned to look at the older woman. Does it get easier? The worry. No. Martha's smile was rueful. Thomas and I have been married 23 years, and I still hold my breath every time he rides out to check the herd. Love makes you vulnerable that way. But it also makes you stronger, gives you something worth fighting for beyond just yourself. The words settled into Clara's heart true and weighted. She did love Luke, had probably been falling in love with him since that first moment in the diner when he'd offered his arm and his protection to a stranger. The realization should have terrified her, but instead it felt like coming home. Luke returned on the morning of the fourth day, riding in with the sunrise at his back. Clara saw him coming from the Duval's kitchen window and was out the door before Martha could call after her, running across the yard with her heart in her throat. Luke dismounted and caught her as she threw herself at him, his arms coming up to hold her tight. "I'm all right," he murmured into her hair. "I'm all right, Clara." She pulled back just enough to search his face, checking for injuries, for signs of trouble. "Did you find anything more than I hoped for?" Luke's expression was grim satisfaction. "Let's get everyone together. You need to hear this." In the Duval's sitting room with Martha and Thomas listening intently, Luke laid out what he'd learned. Reeves's men drink at a place called the Silver Dollar in Clarkdale. After 2 nights of buying rounds and playing dumb cowhand, they started talking, bragging really about jobs they'd done for Reeves. "Did they admit to burning Clara's cabin?" Thomas asked. "Better." Luke pulled a folded paper from his jacket. One of them, a man named Jack Cordell, got drunk enough to start writing out his exploits. Said he wanted to remember all the places he'd delivered Reeves's justice. He listed properties, dates, methods. Clara's cabin is on that list, along with 5 other homesteads that mysteriously burned or were vandalized in the past 3 years. Clara felt ice and fire warring in her chest. He just wrote it down. Pride makes men stupid. Luke's smile was sharp. I waited until he passed out, copied everything into this paper, then made sure several other patrons saw the original, got 2 of them to sign as witnesses that they'd seen Cordell's handwriting and boasting. Martha leaned forward, eyes gleaming. That's evidence, real evidence that links Reeves's employee to multiple acts of arson and intimidation. It's enough to take to the territorial marshal, Thomas agreed. Sheriff Bradley might be in Reeves's pocket, but the marshal answers to federal authority. He can't ignore documented evidence of criminal conspiracy. Clara felt hope flare bright for the first time in weeks. "Where's the marshal based?" "Tucson," Luke said. 3 days' ride south. "But Clara, this is dangerous. Once we file this complaint, Reeves will know. He'll know we have evidence, and he'll do everything in his power to stop it from reaching trial. Then we move fast." Clara's voice was steady, certain. "We leave today. Ride to Tucson, file the complaint, and get federal protection before Reeves can retaliate." "I'm coming with you," Martha said immediately. An accusation from 2 women and a man carries more weight than just one woman's word. And I can testify about the harassment Thomas and I faced when we first settled here. Thomas nodded agreement. "I'll stay and watch both properties. If Reeves tries anything while you're gone, he'll find I'm not as easy to intimidate as he might hope." They left within the hour, Clara and Luke on horseback, with Martha following in a light wagon that could cover ground quickly. They pushed hard, stopping only when the horses needed rest, eating cold meals in the saddle, speaking little as they focused on speed and distance. Every mile south was a mile closer to justice, but also a mile where Reeves might learn of their plans and act to stop them. On the second day, they saw riders on the horizon, 3 men paralleling their route but staying distant. Luke's hand moved to his rifle. "Could be coincidence," Martha said, but her voice suggested she didn't believe it. "Could be scouts," Luke countered. "Reeves might have men watching the roads." They rode harder, pushing into the evening until darkness made travel too dangerous. They made a cold camp in a rocky canyon, taking turns on watch through the night. Clara took the midnight shift, sitting with Luke's rifle across her knees, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to every sound that might signal approach. Luke found her there when he woke to take his turn. "See anything? Just shadows and possibilities." Clara handed him the rifle. "Luke, what happens if we get to Tucson and the marshal won't help?" What if Reeves's influence reaches that far? Then we go higher. Governor's office, Federal Land Commission. We keep climbing until someone listens. Luke settled beside her, their shoulders touching. But I think the marshal will help. His reputation is solid. He's sent rich men to prison before when the evidence warranted it. And if he arrests Reeves, what then? Then you get your life back. Your land, your cabin, your future. Luke turned to look at her in the starlight. You get to stop fighting and start living. Clara reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. What about us? What do we get? Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and serious. What do you want us to be, Clara? It was a question that demanded honesty, that couldn't be deflected or postponed. Clara thought about the past weeks, the building and fighting, the fear and determination, the way Luke had stood beside her when everyone else walked away. She thought about kisses on his porch and the solid comfort of his presence, about the way he'd taught her to shoot and build and believe in herself. I want us to be partners, she said finally. In every sense of the word, I want to build my land and help you build yours. I want to wake up knowing you're beside me and go to sleep the same way. I want... She paused, gathering courage. I want what I see in Martha and Thomas. That kind of partnership, that kind of love. Luke's hand tightened on hers. Clara Weston, are you proposing to me? Despite everything, Clara laughed. I suppose I am. Rather forward of me, isn't it? Rather perfect. Luke pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness that made her throat tight. Yes, to everything. Partners love building a life together, yes. They held each other in the darkness, two people who'd found something precious in the hardest of circumstances, and Clara felt certainty settle into her bones. Whatever happened with Reeves, whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. They reached Tucson on the evening of the third day, the city rising from the desert like a promise. It was larger than Copper Springs, more established, with real buildings and paved streets, and the sense of civilization that came with territorial governance. The marshal's office was near the courthouse, an imposing adobe structure that spoke of federal authority. Marshal James Dutton was a lean man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He listened to their story without interruption, examined Cordell's written confession and the witness statements, and asked pointed questions that showed he understood exactly what they were alleging. Harlan Reeves is a powerful man, Dutton said finally. But he's not above the law, no matter how much he'd like to think otherwise. This evidence is compelling, Miss Weston. Combined with your testimony and Mrs. Duval's account of similar harassment, I believe we have grounds for arrest and prosecution. Relief flooded through Clara so intensely she felt dizzy. You'll arrest him. I'll do better than that. Dutton stood, his expression grim. I'll investigate every property on this list interview, every homesteader Reeves has harassed, and build a case so thorough that even the best lawyers in the territory can't dismantle it. Reeves has been operating with impunity for too long. It's time someone held him accountable. When? Luke asked. I'll ride north tomorrow with 6 deputies. We'll arrest Reeves and this Jack Cordell, secure any records from Reeves's ranch that might provide additional evidence, and bring them back here for arraignment. Dutton looked at Clara seriously. This will take time, Miss Weston. Months probably before it goes to trial. Reeves will make bail, he'll hire expensive lawyers, he'll fight every step of the way. Are you prepared for that? Clara thought about her burned cabin, her poisoned well, the threats and fear and constant battle. I'm prepared, Marshal, whatever it takes. Dutton nodded.
This story
with
was
something
posted
like
on the
approval.
channel west of
Then we'll
Betrayal.
see this through
Please
together.
do not repost it.
They stayed
any
in
form.
Tucson for 2 days while Dutton prepared his operation, giving statements, signing affidavits, doing everything necessary to ensure the legal process was ironclad. On the third morning, they watched Dutton and his deputies ride north toward Copper Springs, carrying warrants and the weight of federal law. The ride back north was slower, less desperate. Clara felt like she could breathe fully for the first time in weeks, like a weight had been lifted from her chest. Justice was coming. Not immediately, not easily, but coming nonetheless. They stopped at Martha and Thomas's ranch first, sharing the news and the celebration that followed. Thomas broke out whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion, and they toasted to justice and courage and the stubborn refusal to be broken. "What will you do now?" Martha asked as the evening wound down. "While you're waiting for the trial." "Build," Clara said simply. "Finish my cabin. Dig a new well. Plant crops if there's time before winter. Live my life the way I always intended, on my own land, on my own terms. Not entirely on your own." Luke added his hand, finding Clara's. "We're getting married." The announcement brought fresh celebration, Martha embracing Clara with fierce joy while Thomas clapped Luke on the back. They spent another hour making plans, a simple ceremony in Copper Springs. Martha standing up with Clara, Thomas with Luke, nothing fancy but everything meaningful. When they finally rode back to Luke's ranch, the stars were brilliant overhead, and the desert air carried the first hint of autumn's coolness. Clara leaned against Luke as they rode double on his horse, Daisy following behind on a lead, and felt peace settle into her soul. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For that first day in the diner. For pulling up a chair beside me when everyone else walked away. For teaching me to fight and build and believe in myself. For—" She paused, emotion thick in her throat. "For seeing me. Really seeing me." Luke's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for letting me. For being brave enough to stay when everything told you to run. For being the kind of woman who fights for what's hers." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and Clara thought about how much had changed since that scorching day in June when she'd stood outside Peterson's diner, hungry and humiliated and alone. She'd found land and home and purpose. But more than that, she'd found herself the strong, determined woman she'd always been but never had the freedom to become. And she'd found Luke the partner she'd never known she needed. The next weeks passed in a blur of purposeful activity. Word spread through the territory that Marshal Dutton had arrested Harlan Reeves and Jack Cordell, that federal charges were pending, that the empire of intimidation was crumbling. The response was remarkable. Homesteaders who'd been driven off their land years ago came forward with their own stories of harassment. Other ranchers who'd suffered under Reeves's dominance suddenly found their courage and their voices. The trial was set for January, 4 months away. In the meantime, Clara and Luke worked side by side, rebuilding what Reeves had tried to destroy. The new well hit water at 30 feet, sweet and cold and abundant. The adobe cabin was completed with a proper roof and real glass windows Luke ordered from Tucson. Martha and Thomas helped, as did several other neighbors who'd found their own courage in Clara's refusal to be broken. On a crisp October morning, Clara and Luke were married in the small church in Copper Springs. The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional, but the meaning ran deep as bedrock. Clara wore a dress Martha had helped her sew, simple blue calico that matched Luke's eyes. Luke wore his best shirt and looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. Even James Peterson attended, standing in the back with his hat in his hands. After the ceremony, as people gathered for the modest celebration at Martha's ranch, Peterson approached Clara with evident discomfort. "Miss Weston, Mrs. Callahan, now, I suppose." He cleared his throat. "I wanted to apologize for that first day, for turning you away. I was—" He struggled with the words. "I was wrong. About you. About what kind of woman you are." Clara studied him for a long moment, remembering the humiliation and hurt of that rejection. Then she extended her hand. "Thank you for saying so, Mr. Peterson. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong." Peterson shook her hand with visible relief, and Clara saw several onlookers nodding approval. It was a small moment but significant, the beginning of acceptance of being seen as part of the community rather than an outsider to be feared. The celebration continued into the evening with food and music and the kind of joy that comes from surviving hard times. Clara danced with Luke under the stars, his arms strong around her, his smile soft with happiness. Around them, their neighbors celebrated not just a wedding, but a victory. Clara's refusal to be broken had given them all hope that things could change, that bullies could be defeated, that justice was possible, even in the rough frontier. "Happy," Luke murmured against her hair. "More than I thought possible," Clara replied honestly. 6 months ago I had nothing. Now I have everything." "We have everything," Luke corrected. "Partners, remember." "Partners," Clara agreed, kissing him as applause and good-natured catcalls rose from their friends. They spent their first night as husband and wife in Luke's house. Their house now, though they planned to build something larger, eventually, something that bridged both their properties. Clara fell asleep wrapped in Luke's arms, listening to his steady heartbeat, feeling safer and more content than she'd ever felt in her life. Winter came to the Arizona territory with cold nights and brilliant days. Clara and Luke worked both properties, combining their herds, planning how they'd manage the expanded operation. Clara discovered she had a talent for the business side of ranching, for keeping accounts and negotiating prices. Luke handled the physical labor with the same steady competence he brought to everything. In January, they traveled to Tucson for Reeves's trial. The courtroom was packed, standing room only, with dozens of people who'd come to see justice done. Marshal Dutton presented a devastating case, the written confession testimony from victims' financial records showing payments to known criminals, evidence of systematic intimidation and property destruction. Reeves's lawyers were good, but they couldn't overcome the weight of evidence. After 3 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Reeves was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison, and Jack Cordell got 10. Several of Reeves's other men accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony, receiving lighter sentences but ensuring the entire operation was dismantled. Clara sat in the courtroom and felt no triumph, just quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about ensuring no one else would be terrorized the way she'd been. As they left the courthouse, several people stopped her to shake her hand, to thank her for her courage, to tell her their own stories of suffering under Reeves's dominance. "You changed things," one old homesteader told her, tears in his weathered eyes. "You stood up when the rest of us were too afraid. You gave us back our dignity." Clara didn't feel heroic. She just felt grateful for Luke, for the friends who'd stood beside her, for the land that had demanded everything and given back more than she'd dreamed possible. They returned to Copper Springs to find more changes underway. The sheriff Bradley had resigned under pressure and a new election was being organized. The town council, emboldened by Reeves's fall, was passing ordinances protecting homesteader rights and limiting the power of large ranchers. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Spring came, and with it, Clara's first successful planting. The crops Luke had taught her to choose for the Arizona climate took root in soil she'd spent months preparing. She worked the fields while Luke managed the cattle, and in the evenings they sat on the porch of their expanding house. They'd added 2 rooms over the winter and planned their future. "I've been thinking," Clara said one evening as the sunset painted the sky impossible colors, "about what Martha said, about how I'm building more than just a home." And Luke prompted, his hand finding hers in the gathering dusk. "I want to help other homesteaders, women especially. Teach them what you taught me how to build, shoot, survive out here. Maybe set up some kind of cooperative where we share resources and knowledge." Clara turned to look at him. "I don't want anyone else to feel as alone as I did that first day." Luke's smile was warm with pride and love. "That sounds perfect. We've got the land for it and the knowledge. And I suspect Martha would be very interested in helping." They spent the following months bringing that vision to life. Clara reached out to new homesteaders arriving in the territory, especially women traveling alone or families struggling to establish themselves. She taught them adobe construction and water conservation, how to judge soil and plan crops. Luke taught defensive skills and animal husbandry. Martha contributed her decades of frontier wisdom. Word spread, and soon people were coming from across the territory seeking advice and assistance. The cooperative grew organically, homesteaders helping each other in ways that made survival less brutal, more communal. It wasn't the individualistic frontier of legend,
This story
but
was
something
posted
better.
on the channel west
A community
of the trail.
of mutual support.
Please do not
where strength
repost it
came from
in any
connection
form.
rather than isolation. On a warm June evening, exactly 1 year after Clara had first arrived in Copper Springs, she stood on the porch of her cabin, completed now, expanded truly, a home, and marveled at how much had changed. The land that had seemed so hostile and impossible now felt like an extension of herself. The cabin that had burned was rebuilt stronger. The well that had been poisoned was replaced with one that never ran dry. Luke emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Clara before settling beside her on the bench they'd built together. "Thinking about something, everything," Clara replied. "A year ago today, I stood outside Peterson's diner thinking my life was over, that I'd made a terrible mistake coming here. And now, Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Clara leaned into Luke's shoulder. This land, this life, it's everything I needed without knowing I needed it. Luke kissed the top of her head. You know what I realized? That first day in the diner when I offered you my arm, I thought I was being chivalrous, helping a stranger. But really, you were helping me. Clara looked up at him questioningly. I'd been going through the motions for years, Luke explained. Building my ranch, surviving, but not really living. Not letting myself connect with anyone because the war had taught me that caring meant losing. Then you walked into my life fierce and stubborn and refusing to give up, and you reminded me what it meant to fight for something, to care about something beyond just surviving. So we saved each other, Clara said softly. We did. Luke set down his coffee and pulled her close. And we'll keep saving each other, every day, through whatever comes next. They sat together as the stars emerged, two people who'd found each other in the hardest of circumstances and built something beautiful from that meeting. Around them, the desert settled into its evening rhythms. Coyotes calling in the distance, the wind sighing through the sage, the vast space of the Arizona territory spreading away in all directions. Clara thought about that first moment when Luke had pulled up a chair beside her, refusing to let her face the world's cruelty alone. It had seemed like such a small gesture at the time, just one person extending kindness to another. But it had changed everything, had given her the courage to claim her land fight for her rights, become the strong woman she'd always had the potential to be. And in the years that followed, Clara and Luke made it their mission to offer that same grace to others. Every time a weary traveler arrived in Copper Springs, every time a homesteader faced intimidation or a woman traveling alone was denied service, they were there, pulling up a chair, offering help, proving that kindness was just as powerful as cruelty, that community could defeat tyranny, that love and partnership could transform even the harshest landscape into home. The frontier was still wild, still unforgiving in many ways. But within its dust and dawn, Clara and Luke had proven something essential, that courage wasn't just refusing to break under pressure, but choosing to help others stand firm against it. That love wasn't weakness, but the strongest foundation for survival. That home wasn't just a place, but a feeling of belonging, hard-won and precious. Years later, when their daughter Hope was old enough to understand, Clara would tell her the story. About the diner that turned her away, and the cowboy who pulled up a chair beside her. About fires and threats and poisoned wells. About rebuilding and resistance and refusing to be broken. About how sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with romance, but with simple human decency. One person seeing another's struggle and saying, "Let me help." And Hope would grow up understanding that legacy would carry it forward into her own life, would teach her own children that the measure of character isn't how you treat those who can help you, but how you treat those who need help from you. The chair Luke pulled up beside Clara that scorching June day became a symbol across the territory of solidarity, of resistance, of the radical act of choosing kindness over cruelty. And in the generations that followed, whenever someone needed help, there would always be someone willing to pull up a chair, to stand beside them, to prove that no one has to face the world's hardness alone. That was Clara and Luke's greatest legacy. Not the land they accumulated or the wealth they built, but the simple revolutionary act of caring for strangers, of extending grace to the vulnerable, of proving that even in the hardest places, humanity could flourish if people chose connection over isolation. The Arizona sun set on another day, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, and Clara Callahan, once Clara Weston, frightened and alone, sat on her porch beside the man she loved, on land she'd fought to keep surrounded by community she'd helped build. She'd come to the frontier looking for survival and found instead a reason to live. Found purpose, found love, found herself. And in the end, that was the greatest homestead of all. Not the physical land with its boundaries and deeds, but the internal territory of strength and courage and compassion she'd claimed inch by hard-won inch. That was the inheritance she'd leave behind, worth far more than 160 acres of Arizona territory. That was the story of the woman who was denied service at the diner and the cowboy who pulled up a chair beside her, and how together they changed not just their own lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it meant to be human in a place that so often forgot.